Good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for joining our afternoon breakout on unlearning. I'm Elizabeth, and I work for TNTP, and I am so excited to be here today with our very special guest speaker, Emily Hanford, who's going to be talking to us today about unlearning, how we teach kids to read. And I'm going to go ahead and get Emily to join us here. Hey, Emily. So I'm so excited to have Emily here with us today. And this morning we heard Robin, our keynote address, talk about all the work that she's been doing in Sullivan County to rethink how they are teaching literacy to their early elementary students. And I know that Emily's work has been very transformational for Robin and the folks in her district as well. So I'm excited to get to follow up on that. Emily is an award-winning reporter who's been working in public media for more than 25 years. She's currently the senior education correspondent for APM Reports, which is the documentary and investigative group at American Public Media. Her groundbreaking work on early reading instruction sent shockwaves across the United States and around the globe for bringing mainstream media attention to the importance of teacher knowledge about the science of reading. I know that personally, as a person who is homeschooling or helping with virtual learning for a first grader, Emily's work has been really helpful for me as a parent as well. And so I'm excited to have her join us today and to present on some of her research. So Emily, I'm gonna pass it over to you. And so thank you so much for being here.
Hi, good afternoon or morning for those of you. So I'm gonna share my screen here. And you see that? Are we good?
I do not see it.
You don't see it?
Let me figure out how to do this. I see it teeny tiny, but that's probably my fault.
I can see it.
You can? You can see the full screen?
Yeah. Got it. Yep, you're good. Sorry about that.
Okay, good. All right, great. All right, well, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I am here today to tell you what I've learned about the science of reading over the past few years. I'm not a reading researcher. I'm not a reading teacher. I'm not the parent of a struggling reader. I'm a reporter, as you just heard. And I've had the opportunity over the past 4 years to read thousands, literally thousands of pages of books, reports, and articles about how skilled reading works, what kids need to learn to become skilled readers, and what's going on when children struggle to learn how to read. I've also talked with hundreds of people and visited 10 states when we could still do that, to try to understand how reading is being taught in American schools today. And what I've learned has shocked me. And it's basically this. Over the past 50 years or so, cognitive scientists and psychologists and neuroscientists and linguists and other researchers all over the world have conducted thousands of studies in labs and classrooms to try to understand how we learn to read. But this mountain of scientific evidence about reading is not making its way into many schools. Teachers and other educators are not, for the most part, being taught this science in their teacher preparation programs. They're not taught this science in professional development they get on the job. In fact, some of what they learn about reading and how to teach it is actually at odds with what the scientific evidence says. But I didn't know any of this a few years ago. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about me. I have been a reporter. Ooh, let's see, next slide. Sorry. I think this is maybe the problem that I had before. Here we go. Okay. All right, there you go. You can see the second slide, I think. All right, so I have been a reporter for 25 years, and I have been covering education full-time since 2008. And in my education reporting, I have been particularly interested in how family income generally and how poverty in particular affect educational outcomes and opportunities. And I've also been really interested in how people learn, and in particular, the findings from cognitive science and how those play out or not in classrooms. So almost all of my reporting was focused on secondary and post-secondary education. The photo of me in the classroom with the little kids was the first reporting project I did for American Public Media. It was about preschool. And then I didn't do much on earlier elementary education until I got interested in reading a few years ago. And that is when I realized that early reading instruction is where it's at if you are interested in educational equity, opportunity, and how people learn. So this is the first reporting Oh, it doesn't like the way that I'm sharing my screen. Hold on. There we go. Okay. This is the first reporting project that I did about reading back in 2017. Hard to Read is a podcast episode and an article about why students with dyslexia have such a hard time getting what they need in public school. I knew really nothing about dyslexia, but I was hearing the same story, like the exact same story from parents all over the country. And here is how the story goes. My child started school and I knew something wasn't right. I went to the kindergarten teacher and she told me, don't worry, read lots of books to him, everything will be fine. But reading was just hard for him. He didn't seem to get it. I went to the first grade teacher and she said, don't worry, all kids learn differently, he'll catch up. But he didn't seem to be making much progress. By second grade, he was avoiding reading. He was telling me he didn't want to go to school. The teacher said, don't worry, we just haven't found your child the right book yet. It'll all come together in time. And it went on and on like this. The parent saying something's not right, the school saying everything's fine, and the parent not knowing what to do because the schools are the education experts, right? By now, the mom might be thinking, could my child have dyslexia? But when she brings dyslexia up with the school, they tell her, no, we don't say that here. We don't use the word dyslexia. Maybe her child gets pulled out of the classroom for some extra help. Maybe he gets some accommodations eventually, extra time on tests, maybe some audiobooks. But the boy still does not really learn how to read because he is not taught how to do it. Because this is what I've learned in my reporting. The school does not actually know that much about how reading works, which means the school doesn't really know what's going on when a child is struggling to read. And at the end of the day, they don't really quite know what to do about it. I took a class on the science of reading last winter. Many of my classmates were teachers, and here's what some of them said to me about their preparation to teach reading. I didn't feel adequately prepared to teach reading. This is hard for me to admit because I have several degrees and felt like I should know what I was doing. Another teacher said this. I kept falsely reassuring myself my students weren't making growth because of this reason or that reason, although deep down I feared it was me and my instruction. I wasn't adequately prepared. It's not that I didn't care, it's that I didn't know any better. And this, I felt so angry and guilty when I was finally taught the basics of reading science. I thought, how did you let me teach literacy without knowing this? So I'm going to explain some of the basics of the science of reading in just a minute, but first I want to finish the story of the worried mom with the struggling reader. Here's what happens if she has the time, and especially if she has the money. She takes things into her own hands. She pays for private testing, that can cost thousands of dollars. She pays for private tutoring, more thousands of dollars. She hires an educational consultant or an attorney or maybe both to help her fight for what her kid needs in school. All of this is not just expensive, it's exhausting, it's frustrating, and it's really, really, really hard. And the mother begins to realize her child may never get what he needs in public school, or anyway, he's not going to get it fast enough because now he's 8 or 9 years old and he's really starting to hate school. And he's falling behind in other subjects because he can't read well enough. Maybe he's beginning to act out in school, or maybe it's manifesting as anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. And maybe her child, who's 8 or 9 years old, has actually said to her, I want to kill myself. I have heard this from a number of parents, little kids who say they want to die because they can't read. This is when, if they have the resources, the parents pull their child out of public school. Maybe they homeschool him, or maybe the family figures out a way to come up with the tens of thousands of dollars that it can cost to send the child to a specialized private school if there's a good private school nearby. At one point, I was with a group of moms in a dyslexia advocacy group, and I realized that none of them had their struggling readers in public school anymore. They had all given up on the idea that public schools could help their kids learn how to read. They were still fighting for other people's children, though. Here's the situation that we're in this country. If you can come up with the money to pay for it, you can probably find a way for your struggling reader to be taught how to read. But if you don't have the money and your child is not learning to read in school, what do you do? The equity implications of this are stunning. If you are from a low or even a moderate income family, there's no safety net. There's no backup if you're not being taught to read in school. As one mom put it to me, getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game. Reading, the most basic and fundamental skill, the foundation upon which all academic learning is built. That is a rich man's game. So how did this happen and how is it allowed to continue? This is what led me to the next reporting project called Hard Words. Oh, there we go. Okay. This podcast episode and article was from 2018, and it's about core reading instruction. So not what needs to be done for struggling readers in particular, but rather what do all children need to learn to become good readers? The bottom line from decades of scientific research is this: what kids with dyslexia need to learn to become good readers is not substantially different from what all people need to learn to become good readers. Kids with dyslexia may need a more intense dose of a certain kind of instruction, but all kids benefit from the kind of instruction that kids with dyslexia desperately need. Hard Words focus quite a bit on phonics instruction for two reasons. One, phonics has been the focus of so much debate and controversy for years, for centuries really. When people are fighting about reading, they're usually fighting about phonics. It's like the lighter fluid in the wars about reading. The other reason I focus on phonics is because phonics skills, what scientists have discovered is that phonics skills are critical when it comes to becoming a good reader. And why is that? Because it turns out that the starting point for reading is sound. What a child has to figure out to become a skilled reader is that the words that she hears and knows how to say are made up of speech sounds. Those are called phonemes. And she has to understand that in an alphabetic language like English, phonemes are represented by various letters and combinations of letters. Now, this is something human beings have to be taught. Reading skill does not develop naturally in response to being read to. Learning to read is not like learning to speak. If you immerse a child in an environment of spoken language, unless she has a hearing problem or a severe developmental issue, she is going to learn to speak her native language. Not so with reading. Immersing child in a literate environment is not enough. We are not born with brains that are wired and ready to read. That's because human beings invented written language just a few thousand years ago, which is really recently in the scope of human history. So children need to be taught how their written language works. Some children need very, very little instruction, but some children need a lot. This slide by a woman named Nancy Young compiles estimates from a number of different studies, and it shows basically this. About 40% or so of kids are going to learn to read no matter how you teach them. A little bit of instruction and immersion in a literate environment is probably going to do the trick. But most children, more than half, are not going to learn to read very well unless they're explicitly taught how their written language works. And some kids are going to need a whole lot of explicit instruction. A key thing for educators and policymakers to understand is that all kids benefit from being taught how their written language works. Even those kids who may not need it can become better readers and better spellers in particular if they are taught how their written language works. So no one is arguing that phonics instruction is all children need to become good readers. It is not. There is much more to teaching a child how to read than teaching phonics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of reading. To start and understand how kids learn to read and what scientists have figured out about that, a really good place to begin is with something called the simple view of reading, which does not say reading is simple. It simply says that reading can be divided into two different parts. So the simple view was first proposed quite a long time ago. I was still in high school. It was 1986. Researchers Philip Goff and William Tunmer came up with this model. They proposed it because there was a whole lot of fighting going on about phonics, and they were trying to clarify the role of decoding in reading comprehension. Everyone agrees that the goal of reading is to comprehend text. The question is, how does a little kid get there? The simple view says that reading comprehension is the product of two things, not the sum, it's the product. One is your ability to decode words. So you see the letter string R-E-A-D-I-N-G, and you know that that string of letters represents the word reading. The other part of the equation is your language comprehension. That's your ability to understand spoken language. So we're not talking about your ability to read text. Language comprehension is your ability to understand meaning when someone is talking or when text is being read out loud to you. So for example, when someone says to you, she is reading the book, you know what the verb means in that sentence. You know what she's doing. The simple view says that if you have really good language comprehension skills, but zero decoding skills, your reading comprehension will be 0, because 0 times anything is 0. The simple view also says that if you have really good decoding skills, but very poor language comprehension skills, you just don't know the meaning of that many words in spoken language, your reading comprehension is not going to be very good either. So let's look at how this applies to learning how to read. Most kids entering school have very little when it comes to the decoding part of the equation. They have 0 or close to 0 when it comes to the D in the simple view of reading equation. But they do have something when it comes to the language comprehension part of the equation. In other words, when children enter school, they know the meaning of lots and lots of words, but they don't know how to decode those words yet. This is why people familiar with the science of reading call for an emphasis on phonics instruction in the early grades. Because if the goal is to get to reading comprehension, and you have a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds before you with language comprehension skills, but virtually no decoding skills, what do you need to do to help those children get to reading comprehension? You need to help those children develop decoding skills. What you want to focus on with little kids is getting their decoding skills up to their level of language comprehension. Now, the simple view clearly shows that focusing only on decoding would be a very big mistake because it's only half the equation. And as everyone knows, kids come into school with very different language comprehension skills. Some kids know the meaning of lots and lots and lots of words, and some kids have far smaller vocabularies. So reading instruction that aligns with the simple view has to focus on the language comprehension part of the equation too. This means lessons and activities that expand children's oral vocabularies. So I was in a first grade classroom in Oakland, California, where reading instruction was intentionally aligned with the simple view of reading. And what I saw was explicit phonics instruction in one part of the reading instruction. Kids were broken into small groups depending on the level of their decoding skills, because kids are at very different levels. And another part of the reading instruction was explicit vocabulary lessons and lots of reading out loud by the teacher. The words the kids had learned were posted on cards all over the classroom, and this was the late winter, so there were cards everywhere. They were starting to cover the windows. And they included words like gigantic, extraordinary, neighborly, and ridiculous. Now, those are not words that the vast majority of first graders are going to be able to decode, and they shouldn't be expected to. But the first graders in this class were learning the pronunciation and meaning of these words so that when they're able to read them, they'll know what the words mean. By the way, every child in this class spoke a language other than English at home, and many kids in the class, English was their third language. So the simple view was proposed as a theoretical model back in 1986. And the basics of this model have been confirmed by research over and over and over again. The simple view is helpful because it disentangles some of the stuff that is most contentious in the debates about reading. In what's known as the whole language view, and in the balanced literacy view more recently, the focus right from the start of reading instruction should be on getting kids to focus on the meaning of what they're reading. Whole language and balanced literacy are meaning emphasis approaches to reading instruction, as opposed to what's known as a code emphasis approach, which emphasizes decoding skills at the beginning of reading instruction. Early reading instruction that aligns with the scientific research is a code emphasis approach so that kids can get to meaning. Everyone agrees that meaning is the goal. The question is, how does a little kid get there? So this is another model for understanding how skilled reading works. It's known as Scarborough's rope. Hollis Scarborough is a psychologist at Haskins Labs. She's been studying reading development since the 1980s. This rope helps unpack what goes into each side of the equation put forth in the simple view. So the upper strand is language comprehension, and this model shows that language comprehension is complex. It's not just all the words you know the meaning of an oral language. It's your level of knowledge. It's the stuff you know. It's your understanding of how language works, language structure, grammar, your ability to make inferences and understand things like metaphors. This is a more nuanced explanation of what goes into the language comprehension part of the simple view equation. And it can help teachers understand what might be going on when kids are decoding well, but they're still struggling with reading comprehension. Very often they have a language comprehension issue. Now, the lower strand of Scarborough's rope is the word recognition strand. So like in the simple view of reading, Scarborough's rope shows that without good word recognition skills, you're not going to become a skilled reader. And the rope unpacks the various skills and abilities that go into word recognition. You can see that one element is decoding. This is basically your phonics knowledge. Do you have a good understanding of how letters and combinations of letters represent the sounds in words? Teaching children the basic letter sound correspondences in the English language gives them access to successfully sounding out more than 80% of the words in English print. That's a lot, 80%, but that's not all of them. Children need more than just phonics knowledge to be successful with written English. That's why I think it's more useful to think about teaching children how their written language works. English spelling is not just based on the sounds in words. English is what's known as a morphophonemic language, meaning that our spelling patterns are based on both sounds and meaning. So to understand English spelling, kids should be taught some morphology. In other words, they need to understand the meaningful parts of words and how English words are put together, root words and prefixes and suffixes. And children need some etymology too. That is, to understand English spelling, to really understand why it's the way it is, it helps to know something about the history of our language. English has this reputation for being a wacky language full of exceptions, but it's not. It's a melting pot language that has complex spelling patterns because English has roots in Greek and Latin and French and other languages. Written English is perhaps the most difficult alphabetic language to learn. It takes 2 to 3 years for a typically developing reader to master the basics of written English. By contrast, it takes only a few months for kids in Italy, for example, to learn how to decode Italian, because Italian spelling is almost perfectly regular. Italian is spelled the way it sounds. One of the reasons that we've fought so much about reading instruction in the English-speaking world is there is a lot to teaching children written English. So there's a lot to argue about in terms of how to teach it. But back to Scarborough's rope model and the elements of the word recognition strand. So there's phonological awareness, that's understanding the sounds in words. There's decoding, understanding how letters represent those sounds. And there's something called sight recognition. And this is where things get really interesting, in my opinion. When you are a skilled reader, it turns out, you don't actually have to decode most of the words you encounter. When you see a word that's familiar to you, you know the word immediately on sight. You don't have to sound it out. Scientists refer to the words that are instantly recognizable to you as sight words. Now, the term sight words can be really confusing because teachers and reading scientists usually mean different things when they use that term. In schools, sight words are typically words kids are supposed to memorize. They may be words with unusual spellings that are difficult to decode, or they may be words that kids are going to come across a lot in their reading, in other words, high-frequency words. So children often come home with these words on flashcards, and they're supposed to memorize them. But what the science shows is that having kids memorize lots of words is not the best path to good word recognition skills. And it turns out that weak word recognition skills are the most common and the most debilitating source of reading problems. Struggling readers may also have language comprehension issues, but when children do not get off to a good start with decoding, it has an impact on the continued development of their language comprehension. And eventually, kids may be weak on the language comprehension side of the equation because they are weak on the word recognition side. This problem has been called the Matthew effect. It's a biblical reference. Basically, when it comes to reading, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And here's how it works. If you come into school with lots of language comprehension, but you struggle with learning how to decode words, your ability to continue to develop language comprehension may be impeded, because one of the best ways to increase your knowledge and your vocabulary and your reasoning and your understanding of the structure of language is through reading. In contrast, if you come into school weak on the language comprehension side, but you are taught how to decode, you have just been given the gift that is your best bet for gaining knowledge and vocabulary because you can read the words. This is why equity in education begins with good phonics instruction in the early grades. It's one of the most important things teachers can do to try to even the playing field between kids who come from homes that give them an edge on the language comprehension side and kids who come from homes that may not be as rich and resourced when it comes to vocabulary development and access to knowledge. Good phonics instruction is where educational equity begins. It doesn't end there, but it's a foundation. Now, the good news is that most schools seem to be doing some kind of phonics instruction these days. Publishers and authors of curriculum materials know that if their stuff is going to have a chance of being considered research-based, there has to be some phonics. And if they didn't know that or believe it until recently, they're quickly adding a phonics component now. So that means we must be on the right path, that reading instruction is finally starting to line up with the science. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure, because while more and more schools are adding a 20 or 30-minute phonics block, what I also see in schools are things like this. So these are word reading strategies, and you will find them in schools all over the country. I have seen these strategies everywhere. They're on posters in classrooms, they're on bookmarks sent home with kids, they're on Pinterest, they're on Teachers Pay Teachers. You can Google and find a whole bunch of them. I have also seen things like this. These are all strategies for kids to use when they're reading and they come to a word that they do not know. Now, these strategies seem good. They seem sensible enough. You get to a word you don't know, what can you do? You can look at the picture to try to figure out what the word might be. You don't want to completely guess, so you can look at the first letter. You can look at how the word begins. That will narrow your choices. You can then check to see if you were right. Reread the sentence using the word, see if the sentence makes sense. And if you're stuck, you can just skip the word and move on. Hopefully, you can get the gist of the sentence anyway. So what is the theory of how reading works that these strategies are based on? What's the idea about how kids learn to read words? So these strategies are rooted in a theory about reading that came to be known as 3Qing. And the idea is that readers use 3 different kinds of information or cues to identify words as they're reading. This idea was originally proposed by an education professor named Ken Goodman back in 1967 at the American Educational Research Association conference in New York City. He laid out this theory in a paper that he then called Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game. In the paper, Goodman rejected the idea that reading is a precise process that involves exact or detailed perception of letters or words. Instead, he argued that as people read, they make predictions about the words on the page using these 3 cues. Graphic cues, what do the letters tell you about what the word might be? Syntactic cues, what kind of word could it be? For example, a verb or a noun or an adjective. And semantic cues, what word would make sense here based on the context? In his paper, Goodman concluded, skill in reading involves not greater precision, but more accurate first guesses based on better sampling techniques, greater control over language structure, broadened experiences, and increased conceptual development. As the child develops reading skill and speed, he uses increasingly fewer graphic cues. Now, this was kind of a new twist on prevailing ideas about how reading works, and it went on to become the theoretical basis of the whole language approach to teaching reading. For the couple of centuries previous to the introduction of whole language, the debate about how reading works and how to teach it had focused on one of 2 big ideas. So one idea is that reading is a visual memory process. The teaching method associated with this idea is the whole word method. So the basic idea is you see words enough, associate those words with their meaning, you eventually store the words in your memory as visual images, like pictures. This is the basic idea behind long lists of sight words that kids are supposed to memorize. The other idea is that reading requires knowledge of the relationships between sounds and letters, and that the way to identify a word is to sound it out. This is the phonics approach. Reading instruction was a series of pendulum swings between whole word and phonics until this new idea came along that said, well, people don't read by sounding out words. They don't read by memorizing words as whole either. Instead, they use this cueing system. That is, they use context to predict what the words will be, and they use the letters to check their predictions. So many teachers know this cueing theory of word reading as MSV. M is for using meaning to figure out what a word is, S is for using sentence structure or syntax, and V is for using visual information, the letters in the word. You will see this MSV idea in lots of curriculum materials that define themselves as balanced literacy. You can trace the roots of this MSV idea back to the work of a woman named Marie Clay. Marie Clay was a developmental psychologist in New Zealand who came up with ideas about reading that were similar to Ken Goodman's ideas at about the same time. They didn't develop these ideas together. They didn't agree on everything, but they did meet and travel in similar literacy circles back in the 80s and 90s. Clay built her ideas into a reading intervention program for struggling first graders called Reading Recovery. Reading Recovery was implemented across New Zealand in the 1980s and went on to become one of the most widely used reading intervention programs in the world. Clay's theories were popularized as part of core reading instruction here in the United States by Irene Fountas and Gay-Sue Pinnell. They are education professors who learned from Clay back in the 1980s. Fountas and Pinnell are well known for an approach to reading instruction known as guided reading, and for a widely used reading assessment system that uses what are known as leveled books. Fountas and Pinnell also sell a reading intervention program called Leveled Literacy Intervention, or LLI. In a 2019 Education Week survey, 43% of teachers in this country reported using LLI. You will also find the cueing theory of reading in the Units of Study materials by Lucy Calkins at Teachers College, Columbia. Units of Study is more commonly known as Readers and Writers Workshop. And according to the Ed Week survey, 16% of teachers report using these materials to teach reading. You will find some phonics in the Calkins and Fountas and Pinnell approaches. In fact, Lucy Calkins recently created a Units of Study for Teaching Phonics program. Fountas and Pinnell have books and materials to teach phonics too. But phonics is often presented as one way to know what a word is. It's one strategy. It's that third cue in the three cueing system. What schools need to know is that when they buy materials from Calkins and Fountas and Pinnell, they are buying an approach to reading that is rooted in a particular theory about how reading works. And it's the idea that skilled readers use meaning and context to identify words as they read. What you are likely to find in a lot of American classrooms today is 20 to 30 minutes of a phonics program, and then readers workshop and guided reading, where kids are taught that when they come to a word they don't know, they can sound it out and use what they've learned in their phonics lessons. But they can also use the cueing strategies. They can think of a word that makes sense, they can look at the first letter of the word, or they can just take a page from Skippy the Frog and skip the word altogether. So what's wrong with this? Like, why not teach kids lots of strategies to help them when they come to a word they don't know? Why not teach cueing? Well, it comes back to the scientific research. So what is going on in these little boys' brains as they're learning to read? And for a long time, no one knew, and that is why we fought about how to teach reading. But as I have said, over the past half century or so, scientists in labs and classrooms all over the world have done a mountain of studies about how skilled reading works. And here is a key thing that they figured out. Skilled readers do not use cues and context to read words. In fact, what scientists have discovered is that this is how poor readers read. Poor readers often have a hard time with word identification. Too many of the words that they come across are little mysteries, series of letters they don't know and they can't quite figure out. So they use a bunch of other strategies to try to understand what the words say. They memorize as many words as they can. When they come across a word they don't know, they look at the first few letters and they try to think of a word that makes sense. In other words, they use the context to try to come up with a word that fits. And when they can't figure out what a word is using context clues, they skip the word. Often, they can get the gist of what they're reading this way. But using context, guessing and skipping words, this is not what reading is like when you're a skilled reader. What cognitive scientists have figured out is that a key difference between skilled readers and unskilled readers is that skilled readers can immediately and accurately recognize words. They don't need to guess or predict or use context. Skilled readers know tens of thousands of words instantly on sight. In fact, if you're a skilled reader, your brain has gotten so good at reading words that you process the word book faster than you process a picture of a book. So how did your brain get so good at that? It's not designed to do it. It gets good at that through a process that's been called orthographic mapping. So I had to fight my editors to be able to include this term in my reporting. It sounds complex and weedy, intimidating, complicated, dorky, and it is. But educators have to understand the basics of orthographic mapping to understand why phonics is so important and to understand why teaching cueing is not a good idea. So here's a quick and simplified explanation of what orthographic mapping is. Orthographic mapping is the process we use to store printed words in our long-term memory. The way you do that is by attending closely to how a written word is spelled and then linking that sequence of letters to the word's pronunciation and its meaning. So for a very simple example, a child knows the meaning and pronunciation of the word cat, and that word gets orthographically mapped to her memory when she links the sounds k, at to the written word C-A-T. This requires an awareness of the speech sounds and words, that's phonemic awareness. It also requires an understanding of how those words are represented by letters, that's phonics. So you need phonemic awareness and you need phonics to orthographically map words into your long-term memory. And once a word has been orthographically mapped to your memory, you know it instantly on sight. In fact, you cannot suppress your ability to read that word. You don't have to sound it out when you see it. You know it instantly because at some point, you successfully sounded it out. And you linked the spelling of the word in your mind with the meaning and the pronunciation of that word. By about second grade, a typically developing reader who's acquired good phonics skills needs just a few exposures to a word through its pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning, and bam, the word is mapped to her memory. The more words that a reader maps to her memory this way, the more she can focus on the meaning of what she's reading. She's not using her brain power to identify words. She's using her brain power to understand what she's reading, and this is the goal, for readers to comprehend what they're reading. But when teachers use the cueing system I told you about, when they teach all those word reading strategies, they are actually impeding the orthographic mapping process. So I'm going to explain with a story. These are first graders in Oakland, California. And a literacy coach who worked with these girls came to see that teaching the cueing system, or MSV, that meaning, structure, visual idea, was actually making it harder for her students to learn how to read. The coach's name is Margaret Goldberg. She was hired by the Oakland Unified School District in 2015 to teach leveled literacy intervention. LLI is the reading intervention program I mentioned that was developed by Irene Fountas and Gaysu Pinnell, known as Fountas and Pinnell, or F&P. LLI does include some phonics instruction. It also teaches kids that when they come to a word they don't know, they have lots of strategies for figuring out the word. They can sound it out, but they can also use pictures and context and other cues to try to come up with a good guess. Margaret Goldberg started teaching LLI. Around the same time, she found a bunch of unopened materials sitting on a shelf in her school collecting dust, and it was a systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program that teaches kids when they come to a word they don't know, they sound it out, and it doesn't teach any cueing. And in this phonics and phonemic awareness program, beginning readers practice reading in decodable books that contain words with spelling patterns they have been taught, so they don't have to guess at words. Margaret started teaching some of her groups LLI with cueing, and some of her groups she taught systematic phonics and phonemic awareness with no cueing. And she started to notice differences between the two groups of children, not just in how well they were reading, but in the way they approached their reading. She and a colleague recorded first graders talking about what makes them good readers. I'm going to play this video for you, so make sure your volume's up. I'm going to put mine all the way up. Mia's in the white shirt. She was learning phonics with no cueing. And Jabria's in the pink jacket. She was taught the cueing system.
Yes, what makes you good readers?
I learn a lot. Because I look at the pictures and I read it.
Do you remember when you were little and you didn't know how to read?
Yes.
Like when you started
Kind of.
kindergarten?
Yeah.
What helped you learn how to read? How did you learn?
By looking at the pictures,
Anything else?
looking at the words, and sounding them out.
So Margaret Goldberg was seeing this over and over again in her two groups of students. One group was taking away from their reading instruction that reading is about looking closely at words and sounding them out. And another group of children was learning that when you come to a word you don't know, you don't have to look at it carefully and try to connect the spelling with the pronunciation and the meaning. Instead, you can look away from the word. You can look at the pictures, you can look at the other words in the sentence. Basically, you search around for clues to help you identify the word. Now remember, orthographic mapping requires you to look carefully at words so your brain links the spelling with the sounds and the meaning. But cueing teaches kids to look away from words. Here's what Margaret Goldberg said to me about the kids in her LLI groups. She said, "I did lasting damage to these kids. It was so hard to ever get them to stop looking at a picture to guess what a word would be. It was so hard to ever get them to slow down and sound a word out because they had had this experience of knowing that you predict what you read before you read it." As Margaret was noticing the differences between her two groups of students, she was discovering the scientific research on reading. It was not stuff she knew or had been taught. She was shocked by what she was learning and how different it was from what the curriculum materials were telling her about how reading works. But what Margaret was learning from the curriculum materials about how reading works is what lots of teachers are learning about how reading works. Instructional approaches that include cueing are all over American classrooms. This is the podcast and article from 2019 where I tried to explain the problems with the cueing and strategies approach to teaching reading. As I said earlier, most schools do some kind of phonics instruction these days, but just because a school has added phonics doesn't mean that reading instruction aligns with the scientific research on reading. If children are being taught the cueing system, they're being taught to read the way that poor readers read. This, I think, is a big elephant in the room when it comes to reading instruction in the United States today. Schools and publishers are adding what I've come to think of as a phonics patch. They're checking the phonics box, but they're still teaching cueing. Why? Well, lots of reasons, but I think a big one is schools are better at adding things than they are at taking things away. And many educators believe in cueing because if they were taught anything about how reading works, they were likely taught the idea that readers use meaning, structure, and visual cues to identify words as they're reading. And cueing seems to work for some kids because some kids, maybe even most kids in some classrooms, will learn to read no matter how they're taught. They will learn to read in spite of the instruction, but many kids won't. So I'm wrapping up here. What the Words Say is the most recent podcast episode and article where I try to explain the consequences of all of this. It starts with a visit to a juvenile detention center where you will find an awful lot of struggling readers. The big problem we're facing in this country is that reading instruction is based on an assumption about reading that turns out not to be true. The assumption is that as long as kids are in an environment that supports and encourages lots of reading, they will become good readers with a little bit of guidance along the way. When kids struggle to learn how to read under these conditions, there are typically two responses. One, there must be a problem in the child's home. The child wasn't read to enough. Or two, there must be a problem in the child. He or she has a disability. But usually it's neither. Most of the time when kids can't read, it's because they were not taught how to do it. So I'm going to leave you with my contact information and a website where we've collected all of our podcast episodes and articles about reading. I look forward to your questions, but I've only left 3 minutes, so I apologize. Maybe we can do one. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Emily. I think you're right. I think we have one question. Themed question here. We got a couple of questions in the chat about supporting struggling readers who may have additional or different needs. So English language learners, high school students that are struggling to read. So I'm curious what you found in your reporting about supporting different needs in readers.
Well, if you go back to the basics of the simple view of reading, I think it can help you understand a lot of what second language learners need too. And so obviously, like in that classroom that I was in Oakland, it was a huge amount of work on oral vocabulary and language because that's what those kids need. But all kids then need to know how to, the way the written language works and how to decode. And I think these cueing strategies, what I've heard from a lot of teachers was when kids are given these like patterned and predictable books in the early grades is an especial problem. It's especially big problem for language learners because, for example, if like you're going along and you're supposed to be looking like the word is rooster, the kid doesn't know rooster. The kid says chicken, or the kid says a Spanish word for rooster. And so a lot of times the level reading system that starts with these predictable books and really they aren't decodable, really can get a lot of English language learners stuck at low levels when they really might have reading skills that are beyond that, but they're sort of stuck in the way that we assess them. And in terms of kids who are older, what I will tell you is that I hear from teachers and former teachers who taught older kids all the time who just talk about what a gigantic problem it was, that they had all of these kids who really couldn't read. And in some cases, they thought they had sort of a big, broad comprehension problem. But when they really themselves started to understand more about reading, they understood that a lot of these kids really just didn't have good basic foundational skills in how to deal with written English. And a lot of them were continuing to use that cueing system. They were coming across words they'd never seen and they were just taking a wild guess. They were skipping multisyllabic words altogether because they completely freaked them out. They didn't know what to do with long multisyllabic words. And so this is very hard. Obviously, this is one of the reasons why we need to get it right in the early grades, because by the time kids get older, there are so many things that are difficult about helping them. They can be helped. Adults who can't read can be taught how to read. It has been shown it can happen. It needs to be done. But it gets harder as kids get older. Little kids like suck up things. Their brains are just so ready for this. So you teach it well early. And it's hard to find time in the day. By the time kids are in middle and high school, when you're pulling them out of school to do reading help, you're pulling them out of what? Science, social studies, all kinds of other important things. It fits into the elementary school day so much better. And obviously you end up in middle and high school and people there weren't trained how to teach people how to read. So you've got just multiple, I wish I had a good answer to give you, but I can tell you that it's a gigantic problem and one that the nation needs to be working on to figure out what do we do with older kids who are struggling readers, because there are a lot of them.